Good evening, everyone. This is Scott Spratt from Pro Football Focus, and welcome to the Fantasy Slant, powered by Pro Football Focus Fantasy. I'm joined today by Michael Moore again. We had our inaugural podcast last week, and we're happy to say that we're back at it this Monday night. Michael, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you, man? How was 24 last week?
It was awesome. Actually, my favorite part, I think, was at the end. They did the preview for this week, and I'm pretty sure Jack's going to have to outrace a drone trying to shoot him down with missiles while he's in a car. So I'm pretty excited about watching that a little bit later tonight.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So last week we covered some of the rookie running backs and what we thought of them, both in terms of their situation, the veteran backs on their team, and how they'll affect them, whether any of them can be fantasy starters now or in the future. And this week we're going to start the long trek of trying to figure out how that will break down for the fantasy wide receiver rookies. Now, Michael, there are a lot of rookie wide receivers this year, so I think that's something we're probably going to have to cover over more than one episode. So today we'll probably focus more on the guys that may go in the round one of your rookie drafts. However, before we get started with that, we did mention that when important news items came up, we would try to cover that on the show. And, Michael, I think the biggest news of the offseason happened over the weekend, and that was that Jimmy Clausen got signed by the Chicago Bears. So we talked a little bit last week about the fact that you're a 49ers fan. I'm actually a Carolina Panthers fan. And Jimmy Clausen brings back...
This must be a tough day for you, Scott.
So Clausen brings back a lot of really cherished memories for me and my Panthers fandom. And so considering that the Bears only really back up to Cutler right now was Jordan Palmer, since the guy last year, help me with his name, he went to the Buccaneers.
McCown.
Right now. Yes, so Josh McCown, he had a really successful run when Cutler was injured for a while last year. Now they're going to have Jimmy Clausen possibly as the backup. And so I wanted to introduce our first segment on our Fantasy Slant show, which was Over-Under Jimmy Clausen edition. Are you ready to play this game?
I think so. We'll see.
Okay. The rules are simple. You just guess. I'm going to give you an over-under, and you have to guess whether Clausen is better or worse than that in his career. And to give you all a basis of comparison, Clausen started 10 games for the Panthers back in 2010. He played a few more, but that's pretty much his full career right now. So, Michael, over or under a 54% completion percentage?
Oof. I'm going to say under.
Under is correct. Great start. It's a 52.5% completion percentage.
Solid. That's solid.
Okay, career touchdowns thrown, over under 5.
Ooh, 10 games.
10 games as a starter.
He had
more as a backup.
He had Steve Smith for a bit. I'm going to say over.
Ooh, Michael, that was a tough choice. It's actually under as well. He threw 3 touchdowns so far in his career.
That is horrible.
Yeah. It's not good. So over under 60 quarterback rating. I don't really know how quarterback rating works, but I know it can go up to like 140 or something.
I'm going to ride this streak, and I'm going to say below.
You were right again. Yes, it's a 58.4. Yes. Now, QBR, that's an ESPN stat that basically evaluates quarterbacks on a scale of 1 to 100. Again, I have no idea how it works, but 100 is good. Is he over or under 12 QBR in his career?
I'm going to go under again, Scott.
I think you're wising up to this game. It is under. It's 11.78 QBR in his career.
Well, almost 12 then. He was close.
Almost 12. Really, I mean, it rounds up. That was probably a little harsh for me to start that with 12. All right, last one. Worst PFF rating in the league in 2010 among quarterbacks. So I'm not giving you an over number. I'm saying, was he the worst quarterback by PFF's passer rating standards?
I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say yes. Jimmy Clausen was the absolute worst.
Trick question. He was not the worst. He was actually only third from worst. Negative 16.7 rating. Donovan McNabb was actually worse that year with a negative 19.2, although I will throw in the caveat that McNabb played 200 extra snaps. So on a per-rate basis, I think we can get that technical here, McNabb was probably better than Clausen was. Also, maybe forgotten, Derek Anderson in his year as a starter in Arizona, negative 24.4 PFF rating that year. And that was in actually 100 fewer snaps than Clausen. And I just want to remind everyone that Derek Anderson is, in fact, the backup in Carolina right now. So we're one Cam Newton injury away from having another really good season there. But anyway, just wanted to bring that up.
I will pray for you, Scott.
add a little bit of levity to the show. And I think that I speak for all Panthers fans and probably for Jay Cutler in that we'd really love to see Cutler miss a little bit of time this year. Nothing serious, nothing that's going to damage him long term, but just so we can get Clausen in there and relive the glory days of my childhood. So
there you go.
Yeah, so that was fun. Now that we've lost all of our listeners, I think we should probably move on to the wide receivers and what we really came here to talk about. Now, Michael, I think everyone or every fantasy league, whether it's a redraft or whether it's a dynasty, and we're going to probably take this more from a dynasty stance for most of these guys, but they have a choice. There are two wide receivers that are, I think, the clear-cut tier above the rest, and you have to choose whether you think Sammy Watkins or Mike Evans should be the number one receiver, and presumably the number one overall player taken in a rookie draft. So Watkins, 6'1", 211 out of Clemson. He's really fast. He's not as big as Evans, who's 6'5", 231 out of Texas A&M. He's got the speed. Evans has the size. I guess you can argue over which team that they landed up on is better. For what it's worth, Watkins was the earlier pick in the actual NFL draft, going fourth overall. Michael, who do you have? Who would you take first, and why?
You know, it may come as a bit of a surprise. I'd probably take Evans if I were picking today, quite honestly. Not to take away from Watkins. I mean, athletically, he's fantastic. I mean, he's up there. It's sort of a 1A, 1B type situation. But the team in Buffalo just scares me, man. I mean, you've got Manuel, who's quarterback, who wasn't bad last year in his rookie year. I mean, he threw for about 60% completion percentage. He had 11 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, was injured some of the time. But, you know, I'm not a believer yet in Manuel, and that offense is going to have to go through him at some point. And for Watkins to be productive, you got to have Manuel play, you know, at least a little bit above average for him to do anything. And we've seen what they've done when they've had dynamic players on their team before in C.J. Spiller, and they just, for whatever reason, refuse to fully utilize him. So, you know, from a situational standpoint, I think Evans is entering what potentially could be a very good offense in Tampa. I mean, you brought Josh McCown in. You had Vincent Jackson, who I think is probably one of the more underrated guys in dynasty and redraft leagues. They drafted Safarian Jenkins. They've still got Doug Martin coming back. I mean, you've got the makings of a very high-octane offense there, who pretty sure they're just going to chuck it a lot. I mean, and they're sort of modeling, you know, if you look at the personnel there after the Chicago Bears of last year in their offense, where you've just got two big, strong guys, and they're just going to throw it up. And, hey, Josh McCown, it worked for him last year. I don't see why it can't work for him this year.
So I think that the situations here are really interesting to compare and contrast. You mentioned that Evans is a guy that you can just throw the ball up to get, but he's not really a standout in that they also have Austin Safarian Jenkins, the rookie tight end, and Vincent Jackson, both of whom I think are 6'5" or taller as well. So do you really see Evans having maybe a short-term touchdown advantage over Watkins, given that there are really a lot of guys here that seem like obvious red zone targets?
Yeah, I think, you know, he's going to get his share. I mean, if you look at that Bears offense, he's sort of going to be the Alshon Jeffrey to Vincent Jackson's Brandon Marshall. So is that going to, you know, is there a lot of targets that they have to divvy up? Sure. But, you know, I think with Evans' ability, and I think they just have a better team in general, I think there's going to be a lot more opportunity for him to score and get catches and get yards than Watkins will be.
I think that's a fair point. I will mention that for everyone that's listening that may not be as familiar with this, the Bills did ship out Stevie Johnson to the 49ers, so that maybe opens up a little bit of room for Watkins to come in and assume the number one wide receiver position immediately. That may help his short-term production, but like you said, we really have to see what the Bills can actually become on offense, and if they can't really move the ball effectively, it could be a long season. And I think a lot of people are going to be depending on E.J. Manuel stepping forward this year, from him into C.J. Spiller and pretty much all of their fantasy options. They need Manuel to really be a good player.
Right, and don't get me wrong, they're going to utilize Watkins. I mean, he's going to play in the slot, he's going to play outside. They're going to give him opportunities, but like you said, it's all on E.J. Manuel. And if you're not an E.J. Manuel believer, then you've got to dock Watkins some points there.
I think that's true, although I'm not really sure you can go that wrong with either of these picks. There are a lot of really good receivers in this draft, but I think everyone will agree that those are the best two, so you shouldn't really feel bad if you have the number one or the number two pick.
Right.
We will, however, now move on to some guys that are a little more controversial and more interesting. In fact, players that may not have a huge consensus among different analysts. I'm just going to go again in the PFF Fantasy Dynasty rookie rankings, just go by that order without sort of hinting in exactly what I think at first. And so using that order, the next wide receiver picked is actually Brandon Cooks, 5'10", 189-pound receiver out of Oregon State. And I have to feel like the situation that he got drafted into has a lot to do with that, because he was the 20th overall pick by the New Orleans Saints. And obviously that is a hugely dynamic offense with a great quarterback in Drew Brees. And it may be one that needs some additional weapons, considering that some of the main targets are aging. What do you think of Cooks in his situation here? Do you think he's the guy that's number 3 on this list because he's probably an immediate impact player, or do you think it's more about his talent in the long term?
Situation is definitely going to be his best attribute in dynasty leagues. I mean, he's entering the Saints offense, which is, historically very pass heavy, and they don't have Lance Moore there anymore. Which, given Lance Moore was not a fantasy stud, but it does create an opening there for that starting lineup for Cooks to crack into. So he's going to start early. They traded up for him, so it's not like he fell into their lap. I mean, they're pretty invested in him and what he can do. And I think you're right. I think they've got some aging guys there. Colston's getting older. They do have Kenny Stills, who I think they would prefer to just keep outside and run go routes all day. So they needed someone opposite Jimmy Graham to sort of get those under routes, go inside. And Cooks, I think, showed that last year. I mean, he won the Blitnikoff Award as the country's best receiver. So, he can do it, and he did it, at a big-time school, and he did a lot more with his size than a lot of other guys. Like you said, he's 5'9", but he can make guys miss. So, you put a guy like that in that kind of offense, and I think, immediately he's going to make an impact. And long-term, you got to figure he's probably going to be one of the lone guys left after guys like Colston and even if Jimmy Graham moves on.
Well, they have to hope that Graham stays with the team because he's still, he's clearly the only guy with any size that's going to potentially be there for the long term. So Cooks was actually the fastest runner at the combine among receivers, and I think that could be a really big boost for him in this offense. He's also a really good route runner. But one of your points that really sticks out to me was that you traded up to get him, and this was sort of the narrative that I remember hearing a lot when they traded up to draft Mark Ingram. And I get that that's not necessarily an apples and oranges comparison because the Saints have always used multiple backs ever since their modern offense has gotten there with Brees, and it may be a little bit harder for a back to stand out when there's 3 guys getting the ball there. But I'm wondering, too, are we looking too much at that as something that's driving Cooks' value? And, we've seen this 1,000 times, other than Graham and maybe Colston to a lesser extent, but none of these guys are getting a ton of targets because there's so many different players that are getting involved. Will Cooks become a frustrating player to own because maybe he has 120 yards and a touchdown, but that's every 4 weeks, and in between he may have a lot of games with only a couple of different looks?
Sure. No, and that's an excellent point, and you're right. There's a lot of targets to go around, but they seem to be gobbled up by Colston and Graham every year. But, also, like you said, they traded up. I want to say this is probably the highest they've drafted a receiver in the Sean Payton, Drew Brees era. So, they obviously put a premium on Cooks, and I think at least the reports initially indicate they're going to find a way to get him the ball. And quite frankly, he's, behind Graham and Colston, he's the most talented guy there. So I think talent-wise, he's just going to win out. And, there's always, Marcus Colston doesn't seem to go away, but he's got to at some point, whether through injury or retirement or something. So, I think long-term Cooks is probably good in that offense, assuming, obviously, you still have Drew Brees and Sean Payton around.
Sure, and Brees is a little younger than I think a lot of people realize. He's the youngest of that sort of trio of Tom Brady and Peyton Manning, so he maybe has a little bit left in the tank beyond their rest of their careers. Before we move on to another receiver, I just wanted to bring up one other point in this offense, and this may be a broader point, but with Darren Sproles now gone, that's a guy that ate up a lot of targets for the Saints over the last few years. Do you see, it's hard to even imagine, but is there possibly a shift in the way this offense may be running? And could that lead to maybe additional targets specifically for wide receivers as opposed to running backs? Or how do you see that change without Sproles there breaking out, and specifically for Cooks?
Sure. I think Cooks is definitely a guy they look at to take some of that. You still have Pierre Thomas there who, people may not know this, he had 70-plus receptions last year out of the backfield. 77.
Crazy.
Yeah, so And he's still there, obviously, for this year. And I think they're probably going to use him a lot in the same way. But, yeah, like you said, you've got that opening there without Moore and without Sproles there that I think Cooks can probably pick up some of the slack. You're going to have, I think, some drop-off from Colston, just natural drop-off because of age and declining ability. And I think that's probably where they figure Cooks is going to slot in. Is he gonna go off for 1,100, 1,200 yards receiving this year? Probably not, but he's a guy that has that potential down the road.
Yeah, okay, that's a great point, and I think I'm with you there so far. So the next guy on our list, Odell Beckham, 5'11", 198 pounds out of LSU. He was actually taken sooner than Cooks with the 12th overall pick by the New York Giants. But I think people are a little bit more pessimistic with Beckham simply because of the offense he steps into. And I'm going to have to ask you specifically whether that's Eli Manning related or what. But I feel like Beckham may be the most polarizing wide receiver among this top set. There are a couple of guys that probably fit that bill, but everyone I talk to either thinks that Beckham is sort of a lock and deserves to be the third pick in a dynasty format, or they think that he has no chance of becoming the number one receiver down the road and belongs more in the teens. You can sort of see that in our PFF fantasy rankings too, that split. So do you come down on one side or the other with respect to Beckham? What do you think of his long-term prospects, and what do you think of whether Eli Manning can sort of rebound and maybe make him into a productive receiver?
Sure. Long-term, I think his outlook's a little better than short-term, quite honestly. I think the Eli Manning thing, I think, just should scare people, quite honestly. I mean, his play dropped off a lot last year. I'm trying to think of an example where a quarterback specifically dropped off that far and rebounded to anything close to what they did in previous years, and nothing comes to mind, quite honestly. Yeah. Right. So I think Giants players in general are probably in a little bit of trouble. Even if you look at best case scenario, if you go back to 2011 when they first started utilizing Cruz in the slot, Nicks outside, I mean, top end you were looking at Nicks going for 1,200 yards, and that was the absolute peak there. So, and that was with a Manning that hadn't quite dropped off the cliff yet. Now we're 4 years later, and you have to wonder if Eli's got it in him. I mean, they did bring in Ben McAdoo from Green Bay. He's using primarily three-wide formations, which is great for Beckham because that means he's going to be on the field most, if not all, the time. But yeah, I think if you're a guy that's not a believer in Eli Manning this year, then you probably need to stay away from Beckham.
Okay, it sounds like you're pretty pessimistic about most of this offense in general, and so maybe this isn't the best question for you, but prior to the Beckham draft pick, I think Ruben Randall was a guy that was rising on a lot of draft boards, and I'm curious from a redraft perspective, would you take Beckham or would you take Randall, or do you think they're close, or how would you stack them up? I think everyone agrees that Victor Cruz is still the number one receiver from fantasy on this team.
Sure. For redraft, I'd probably go Beckham. The reports with Randall all offseason were not good. I mean, even from Giants camp, I mean, you had a lot of guys internally saying he wasn't the guy or he had a way to go. And for me, it was scaring me off a little bit because, look, if you aren't getting the fluff piece from your team this early in the offseason, there's something wrong. So for me, and quite honestly, Beckham's a very good player by himself. I mean, that's not to take anything away from Odell Beckham and his team. It's just the situation he landed on probably could have been better. But as a redraft player for this year, I'd probably go Beckham over Randall.
Okay, that's interesting. Really, beyond the first two guys, the Watkins and Evans, how many of these receivers do you think are worth even? I mean, I guess they're all worth drafting in a redraft format because they have a lot of potential. But are the rest of the guys late round redraft picks, or is there any particular receiver of this set that you think deserves to be considered a little bit higher on your boards?
Sure. I think Cooks is definitely up there. Just like I said, primarily as a function of that offense he's in. Mm-hmm. I'm down on Beckham, but that doesn't mean he shouldn't be drafted maybe late first, early second. He's still going to start, which is still an important part for any dynasty team.
Sure.
And again, if Eli falls off a cliff and they move on, then hey, he's got a whole new lease on life. So. And then I think you've got a guy like Jordan Matthews, who also is a guy that's probably going to start right away. That's definitely someone you should take in the first. So I would say
that's a great segue there.
Yeah.
Matthews is exactly who I was going to bring up next because he's the next guy on the dynasty list. So he was drafted by the Eagles. You knew the Eagles needed to fill a hole after they lost Deshaun Jackson this offseason. And I guess we don't really know. I mean, we're assuming that Jeremy Maclin can come back and be the #1 receiver on this offense, but we don't really know that. And he hasn't really lived up to expectations in his career either. So Matthews at 6'3", 212 pounds out of Vanderbilt, he's not really similar in style to Deshaun Jackson, but he's obviously a player with a lot of upside. And I think that's what you were about to touch on a little bit about his potential as a redraft player. But what do you also think of him as a dynasty option?
Dynasty, I think he's great. As you alluded to, you've got Maclin there, who he re-signed on sort of a one-year prove-it deal after he shredded his knee last year. So, it's not a guarantee he's going to be back next year. They did re-sign Riley Cooper to some pretty good money, but everything has indicated that long-term Matthews should beat Cooper out as far as talent goes. So, I think long-term, and you got obviously Nick Foles, who's a good young quarterback in that offense. You've got Chip Kelly, who, by all indications is probably going to stick around a while unless they go winless this year. So they're going to have that high-powered sort of hurry-up offense for a couple of years, and I think a guy like Matthews, who, I think is going to probably start out in the slot to begin with, could end up being that guy outside. And he doesn't have necessarily top-end speed, but he's got very good hands, he's got very good leaping ability, and he was very productive in college. I mean, he set the SEC record for catches and yards, and that's not a fluky thing. That's not something easily done. So I think for him being in that offense and being the kind of player he is, I think long term he looks pretty good.
Okay, so in a dynasty rookie draft, would you take Matthews ahead of Beckham and potentially even ahead of Brandon Cooks?
I'd probably go Cooks and then Matthews and then Beckham for me.
Okay, interesting. I've seen a lot of people with similar sort of boards there too. Again, because Beckham was such a divisive player.
Right.
Okay, next on the list, we've got a couple of players here that have entered high-powered offenses, and I think that gives them a lot of potential. But there's some questions about exactly how they'll fit, especially in the short term, with some other talented options at receiver on their teams. The first is Davante Adams, who was drafted by the Packers. He's 6'1", 212 pounds out of Fresno State. The second is Cody Latimer at 6'2", 215 out of Indiana, who lands with the Broncos. Of these two, which do you think has the better chance of starting quickly?
I'd probably go Adams on that front. I mean, in front of him, you have Jordy Nelson and Randall Cobb, who I think we can assume are pretty good shots to start. But besides that, you've got Boykin, who, given he came on last year, he showed some promise in the slot there, but as far as talent goes, I think Davante Adams probably has him beat pretty good. So I think over this camp's going to be very important for that Adams-Boykin battle. I think Adams has probably got the better shot over Latimer, who has a top 5 receiver in front of him, and Demaryius Thomas. They signed Emmanuel Sanders this offseason, who's going to be pretty good as that second banana. And then you've got Welker in the slot, assuming he can come back from a concussion, who's pretty good as well. So for me, I think Adams probably has the better shot short term and probably has the better look long term.
Okay, so you like him in both senses.
Yeah.
I think I probably prefer Adams just in terms of ability from what I've seen. But the good thing about Latimer as a dynasty option is that both Wes Welker and Demaryius Thomas are potentially free agents after this season. And really Sanders is sort of a natural player to go from the outside into the slot to succeed Welker there. He's kind of versatile in that sense and maybe makes more sense there because of his size. And that really could open up a chance for Latimer on the outside. The question is exactly how far in the future do you want to project that Peyton Manning can be there and still be the player that he was? Or, he doesn't have to be the player that he was last year, but a productive player. He's pushing 40 and had the neck fusion procedure. Perhaps you're not really looking at a 4-year window of Manning and saying, like, oh, look at this great situation Latimer's going to be stepping into long term.
Right.
I think it's something to at least to consider there, especially, too, because in Davante Adams' case, Boykin is unproven, and you've got a couple of guys in Nelson and Cobb that have had some injury histories previously. He may be forced into duty more quickly just because of the situation around him. And obviously you'd love for that to happen as an Adams owner, considering Aaron Rodgers is the quarterback.
Right. And long term, all 3 of those guys, coincidentally enough, are free agents after this year.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not and given they'll re-sign 1, maybe 2, but I can't believe they're going to re-sign all 3, especially if they're not, if they're all semi-productive, then they definitely aren't going to re-sign all 3. So I think, short-term and long-term, I think Adams is your guy.
Okay, great. So next on the list is Kelvin Benjamin. Now, Carolina pretty much lost everyone that called passes for them last year, except a tight end. So
not Greg Olsen. I've got Greg Olsen in several leagues. He's fantastic.
Yeah, Greg Olsen's probably a guy you want this year, considering the lack of other options at receiver. But they lost Steve Smith. They lost Brandon LaFell. They lost Ted Ginn Jr. I'm not really sure exactly how great of receiver threats they were, but it does open up a lot of potential here. They bring in Jericho Cotchery, who had a very surprisingly effective fantasy season, catching a lot of touchdowns for the Steelers last year, but I think probably most would agree is really known mostly for his blocking ability rather than his actual receiving game. They also brought in Jason Avant, who can potentially play the slot for them, but has never really been a star in the league either. So I think that leaves the door open for a rookie receiver to step in Carolina, maybe more so than anywhere else in the league, which made it a little bit of a surprise that they went with Kelvin Benjamin with the pick. He's 6'5" and 240 pounds. He may have more potential than anybody else in the league, just given what he can do physically. But I mean, most consider him to be one of the least polished receivers coming out of the draft. So I'm not sure exactly how big of a step in and be productive week one guy Benjamin really is. So what do you sort of break this down, Michael? Do you see Benjamin as a guy that can step in because of the situation, or do you think he needs time to maybe develop into a receiver that his abilities themselves maybe not get him there week one?
You know, for me, it'd probably be the latter. Like you said, he's extremely raw. He had exactly one productive season in college, but at the same time, he's a 23-year-old rookie, which, you know, history indicates that if you're a receiver starting off a little older, when you enter the league, you aren't quite as productive long term. And if there's one team, and I know you can probably testify to this, if there's one team that he probably should not have gone to in the draft, it was probably Carolina for all those reasons you said. They have no one on that depth chart, and he's going to have to start right away. They don't have any other choice, I think. And of all the guys that we mentioned up until this point, he was probably the guy that needed some seasoning and needed some practice time the most. But he's not going to get it. If anything, he's going to get the least amount. He's going to be pushed right into it. Because the problem is, if he shows the slightest glimpse of promise in that first week or first couple weeks, the problem with opposing defenses is they're going to catch on to that because they're not afraid of Jericho Cotchery or Jason Avant. They're going to roll over on him and not give him a chance to, you know, do his thing and get in the red zone and stuff like that. So for me, I mean, the talent is all there, and if he could have landed on, say, like a Denver where he could have been behind a couple guys, or something like that, that would have been a lot better for me. I would have had a lot better feeling about him. But to be pushed right in, it's scary, man. What do you think? I mean, they're your team, so what do you got?
I mean, I'm not necessarily sure that he was necessarily the best fit for the Panthers, but from a fantasy perspective, I'm not all that down on Benjamin. But I think he's probably being drafted in an appropriate spot here, maybe as a late first-round rookie pick. But I would caution players not to look at the fact that Cam Newton is a perennial top-5 quarterback and assume that the targets are going to be there for Benjamin, because I think people can frequently underrate just exactly how run-focused the Panthers' offense can be. And they even haven't had all of the running back options in recent seasons. If they can actually string together a series of healthy guys this year, I mean, we forget that 2 years ago Jonathan Stewart caught 47 balls out of the backfield. Yeah. They have some backs that can catch the ball a little bit. And with how much Newton can run, I think Benjamin will probably get a handful of really big plays, and it'll be really cool and impressive, but I'm not sure you're ever going to want to start him this year. However, I do think down the line the sky's the limit because, I mean, Newton can be a very successful deep ball thrower despite his inaccuracies at times because he can just stay alive in the pocket forever. So, I mean, I can imagine in 2 years that Newton to Benjamin is one of the most productive combinations in the sport, but this is a player that you want to take for a fantasy team that is rebuilding potentially or that needs an upside swing. He's not really one of the safe guys out of this list.
Right. Yeah, I feel that way exactly. If you can wait a year or two to fully capitalize on his potential, then he's perfect for you. But if you're looking for a guy that wants to produce now, then a guy like Cooks or Matthews or even Beckham is probably your better shot.
Completely agree. Okay, I want to close this down with a couple of receivers that landed on the Jacksonville Jaguars. And to me, this is super interesting because there's just so much change in this offense. Mm-hmm. It could go a lot of different ways. But the Jaguars selected both Marcus Lee out of USC and Allen Robinson out of Penn State, both in the second round, I believe. Lee was 6 foot, 190 pounds. Robinson's a little bit bigger at 6'3", 220. Lee was pretty much terrible last year at USC, but the prior year was just fabulous and was maybe the best receiver in the country. I'm not really sure how I would characterize him. I feel like he's a player without many weaknesses, but maybe doesn't have a calling card strength. Whereas, I mean, Robinson, like I said, is bigger and hasn't had the drop issues that Lee's had in college, but not as fast, maybe not as polished either. Then again, you also have a brand new quarterback coming in here, and you've got the question marks about Justin Blackmon's potential future with the team. He may not play for them this year, but potentially he'll be back in the future. Hard to say. Can you sort this all out for me, Michael?
Well, I'm actually pretty high on Jacksonville from a dynasty perspective. I think they've got a lot of good young players in place. You've probably heard about Toby Gerhart a lot this offseason, getting 30 carries a game or whatever they're planning for him. But I think there's a lot to like there from a dynasty perspective. I mean, they brought in Bortles. He's going to have a pretty long leash, or rather I should say Henny's going to have a long leash this year. They don't want to start Bortles. So, again, that's another guy that if you can hold on to for a while, then he'd be a pretty good value. But for the receivers, they got, at least in Lee's case, I think he's got a good chance to contribute pretty early. I mean, they're going to need another receiving threat besides Cecil Shorts, who actually did quite decent last year in a subpar offense. So, I think they've got the makings of something there with Lee and Robinson on the outside and maybe Shorts in the slot with Gerhart running the ball. With Lee, I've seen stuff from late first round to early to mid-second, and I think that's probably right. I think he's one of the more polished guys, like you said, coming into the league and starting right away, whereas Robinson's sort of the flip side of that, where he is definitely a guy that needs some polish, he needs some more seasoning, and if he's a guy that you can stash on your taxi squad, he's probably the guy. But yeah, a guy like Lee is fascinating. Like you said, he was probably the top receiver a year ago, and then for whatever reason, the play just completely dropped off last year. And again, I go back to sort of what I mentioned with Eli Manning, which is I'm trying to think of a player, at least in college, at the receiver position that started off so well and had a pretty good decline, but sort of made a bounce back. And I don't know that there's many examples of that. Now, could he be an average to above average guy for dynasty leagues? Yeah, I think that's definitely very possible. But is he going to be a wide receiver one anytime soon? I don't see it with him.
See, that's interesting. Actually, in our PFF Fantasy rookie rankings, I believe that Lee is actually a spot after Allen Robinson. And to me, that wouldn't be the natural consensus, if only because the Jaguars selected Lee first.
Right.
And to me, that's a little strange, too, because if you're taking this sort of as a long-term play, I feel like Lee has the greater upside just because of what he demonstrated as a sophomore in college. To me, that talent hasn't vanished, and maybe injuries or whatever else played a factor in him last season. To me, he's demonstrated that ability more so than Robinson has. And two, if Lee's the more polished receiver right now, I would feel like he could make the sooner impact. So what is exactly the case for Robinson being the earlier draft pick for a fantasy owner that maybe has a late first or early second round rookie pick?
Everything I've seen has said he probably has the higher upside than Lee, at least stuff that I've seen. He had a very
size. You think maybe down the line he becomes the better red zone target?
Yeah, I mean he had a very good 2 years at Penn State. He had very good hands. And I think they're just seeing that he might have the ability to do more. Like you said with Lee, it's not like he does any one thing exceptionally well. He just does everything pretty good. And I think with Robinson, he has the potential to have a couple attributes that are elite level. Now, given we're a long way from that, nobody's saying he should be your first-round pick this year. But he's a guy that if you draft early second round, I think could be pretty good value for you down the road.
Okay, excellent. I think we made through a pretty good list of guys this week. I mean, we just really demonstrated the depth of receivers this year in your rookie drafts. Almost, I think maybe every guy we covered here was a first or second round pick in the real NFL draft. So a lot of these guys could become future assets for you in a fantasy league. So thanks again, Michael, for joining me. I think we're going to have to push the rest of the receivers and maybe get the tight ends into next week's episode. But for the time being, thanks everyone for listening. This was the Fantasy Slant powered by Pro Football Focus Fantasy. And we hope to see you next week.